act of giving a blowjob can be looked at in a metaphorical way, and I can't believe I just said that. Come on, I
Based on the autobiographical novel of the same name, My Husband Won't Fit is a Japanese Netflix series that came out in 2019. At 10 episodes, each ranging from 26 to 46 minutes long, it's not a huge time commitment, but there is definitely a whole lot of food for thought packed into each episode. As the title might suggest, this is a TVMA rated show, so be ready for nudity and lots of sexually related topics and circumstances for those it may concern. The show tells the story of Kumiko and Kenichi, a young couple who meet during college. The entire story covers many years of their relationship and includes several time jumps. At the center of their story, both literally and thematically, is the special circumstance of their relationship and the effect that it has on both their relationship as a whole and on Kenichi and Kumiko as individuals. My Husband Won't Fit is listed as a drama romance, but that doesn't really do it justice. This show is depressing, comedic, lighthearted, disturbing, wholesome, and sometimes just straight up weird. It addresses social and cultural issues as well as some very philosophical and existential ones as well. While this show can be fairly slow-moving and is far from action-packed, the journey these characters go on, both as individuals and as a couple, is definitely rewarding in its own way. From comments I've seen on the internet, it seems that this show is fairly controversial. Plenty of people who would disagree with what I just said due to their dislike of either the characters or how the show presents certain topics and issues. I'll get into this later on more in depth, but for this spoiler-free section, I'll just say I think that as far as the intentions of the show and its commentary, look no further than the title. The issues addressed in this show are culturally very much hidden away and unspoken, and the whole point of the title and the show's depiction of uncomfortable and perhaps frustrating circumstances is to get these things out in the open. This is why the show's title is necessary. These unspoken realities need to be talked about and shown bluntly and directly so there can be no confusion or hiding away from it. In other words, the point is to do what Kumi and Ken themselves have so much trouble with during the show itself. Basically, to fit these topics into our social discourse. Overall, I really enjoyed this show. I really got invested in this couple over the course of these 10 episodes, and it really is kind of a character study or a couple study, if you will. And I grew to care about them a lot. The show does a really good job at challenging you both emotionally and philosophically. It makes you feel and makes you think. And this is mirrored by the characters themselves. Kumi and Ken are constantly pondering and reassessing their own philosophy and feelings during the show, both on their own and together through conversation. And by the end, they come to their own conclusions, just like you as the viewer will come to your own conclusions about these characters and their lives, as well as the issues the show raises. These issues include the concepts of love and sex and how we define them, women's sexuality, marriage and infidelity, education, the powerful programming of people to have sex and reproduce and have children, how much of all of this is genetically encoded within us and how much is learned from our environment, the society and culture we grow up in. If you're someone who enjoys thinking about all of these things, are okay with having your emotional and personal connection to them challenged and pointed out, then I think you're going to enjoy this show a lot. It's a show that sparks great conversation and strong opinions. On top of all that, the acting is great, the cinematography is solid, and even the soundtrack is used to accentuate the character development and commentary of the show. Alright, so if you're thinking of watching this show, here's a couple things you need to know before you watch. 1. This is not a lighthearted, quirky, rom-com, slice-of-life show. Yes, the show can be funny, it can be lighthearted, and have its share of cutesy wholesomeness and feel-good moments, but this show is also gonna get dark, depressing, disturbing, bleak, perhaps even upsetting, and just plain weird, so be ready for that. It certainly does start off very lighthearted, and then quickly and progressively gets darker and more depressing. In my opinion, the journey is definitely worth it, but yeah, the going gets tough along the way. Is the whole trigger warning still a thing? I don't know, but yeah, also trigger warning for depictions of rape for those of you who may be sensitive to that. Number 2, fun fact, there is a very real medical condition known as vaginismus. I hope I'm saying that right. It's a condition that affects many women in the real world. It's a real thing, and it could very well be what Kumi has in this show. So please feel free to do your own research and find out more about it. 3, this show can be pretty slow moving at times, and also it has a lot of philosophical pondering. If you like characters having these kind of conversations and find that interesting, then you're all set. Personally, I did, but some of you may not, and if you like your shows action-packed or drama-filled, then this might get a little boring for you. Although I will say, in the show's defense, there are some very dramatic, crazy moments. Number 4, this is very important. If you are someone who can't stand main characters not speaking up or standing up for themselves, if you really get frustrated with the timid, submissive character type and that shit drives you crazy, be advised that Kumiko definitely fits into this category. A lot of people have difficulty watching shows in which they feel the main character isn't behaving or reacting to situations or circumstances in the same way they would, or in a way that seems right. And that's totally fine. If you are one of those people, then this show could get very hard to watch. All right, that's all you need to know before you watch. Definitely a very polarizing show that will elicit strong opinions and strong emotional reactions. I think it's a very interesting show and it has a lot to say, so definitely go check it out if it's something you think you might be interested in. That's gonna do it for this spoiler-free section of the review. Hope you enjoyed. If you don't want spoilers, it's time for you to stop watching the video here, and whether you leave this review thinking, hey, I'm gonna check this out, looks pretty cool, or I guess this show isn't for me, I just want to say thank you for watching, thanks for visiting the channel, and with that being said, for the rest of you who have seen the show or don't care about spoilers, let's get into some deeper analysis. Alright, so let's structure this analysis around a central question. Why doesn't Kumi's husband fit? In searching for the answer to this question within the narrative, we'll be able to uncover everything the show is trying to say thematically along the way. Now, I'm sure many people who watch this show were looking for a literal answer, a concrete, absolute, definitive answer to this question. But that's not really the point of the show. It's not what it wants you to take away from the experience of watching it. A lot of times in literature and in filmmaking, the end goal is not to give answers, but instead to ask questions. And this can be just as powerful and meaningful a technique in storytelling. For the sake of grounding our analysis in diegetic reality and realism in general, let's just try to answer this question on a literal level, with the angle of finding a definitive answer so we can just get it out of the way. Why doesn't Kenichi fit? Well, we know based on what we've seen during the show that Kumi definitely has some kind of condition, the effects of which make it physically impossible for Ken to fit inside her. They try many times but never quite get there. Based on how this condition is portrayed in the show, one could guess that Kumi has what's known as vaginismus, which is a very real medical condition that affects many women in the real world. Without going too much into it, since I am of course not a medical expert, it seems that this condition has a very psychological element to it. It can occur as a result of not just physical or biological reasons, but also from psychological and emotional ones. Here is a comment I found on Reddit from someone who has had experience with this condition, explaining how its mental aspect can be used to provide a legitimate explanation for why Kumi is able to have sex with other men that are strangers, but yet is unable to have sex with her husband, whom she loves. We can also factor in a major event in Kumi's life, losing her virginity, where she is pretty much raped by a boy she didn't even know the name of at the festival in her hometown. This would most certainly count as a traumatic event capable of bringing about her condition. And as we have seen in the comment on Reddit, it's totally plausible that this condition and its psychological and mental effects could result in her body's selective rejection of intercourse. So there you have it. There's your literal, real-world, realistic answer. Kumi has a medical condition known as vaginismus. The end. Now, of course, in the show, Kumi never goes to the doctor to get this properly and officially diagnosed, and therefore the audience is never given absolute 100% confirmation that this is the reason her husband won't fit, even if it is a reasonable assumption. This answer is only satisfactory if you're looking for an explanation grounded in the literal, real world. But to end our questioning and our exploration there would result in us missing so much of what makes up the fictional, symbolic, metaphorical world of the show. Here, too, is a possible doorway into an explanation to the question many people had when watching the show: why did Kumi never go to the doctor? Well, in terms of storytelling on a thematic level, having her character not go to the doctor and completely confirm what she had as vaginismus opens up the show's ability to suggest to the audience alternatives to this literal explanation, and at the same time to convey its themes and commentary through this uncertainty. Themes and commentary you might miss out on or ignore if you are given an absolute answer. So, in the interest of not missing out and making sure we get every last crumb of food for thought this show has to offer, let's keep exploring this question with the assumption that we are not satisfied with a literal answer, and see where that takes us. Let's start with identifying one of the major metaphors in this show, which is directly linked with the title itself, the idea of not fitting. Again, on a literal level, we already know what doesn't fit. But let's think about what else doesn't fit in this story. The centerpiece of this metaphor is found by looking at our two protagonists, Kumi and Kenichi. Everything else we're going to talk about runs through them. How do these characters not fit? We'll take a look at both of them individually later on, but let's first keep them together as a couple and establish the overall use of their characters within this metaphor. Throughout the show, we see that Kumi and Ken don't really fit in the society around them. This culminates in a resolution from both of them, united as a couple, to reject and defy the society they don't fit within, along with its rules and expectations. Let me back up all of this with some specific evidence and examples. Think about the apartment building they both live in when they meet. They both choose to live there because it is a very cheap place to live and they want to save their parents' money. But this location also represents the characters' feelings towards the society they live in. It is on the outskirts of town and is a place no one wants to live. And being there makes them removed or somewhat on the outside of a society they really don't like much at all, one they feel they aren't a good fit for. So here in the very first episode, the show is already physically placing these characters in an outsider position, foreshadowing how they see themselves and how they approach life based on their circumstances. So why does this outsider mentality and eventual dislike of the society they live in grow stronger as the show progresses? Let's add in the circumstance of their relationship, the fact that they are unable to have sex, and how this separates them even more from society and makes them even bigger outsiders. Let's start with how Kenichi and Kumiko first meet, and how they initially started dating. If we think about it within the context of traditional societal gendered expectations and roles, we can see that the way these two first meet is a perfect microcosm. Each character and their behavior represents an extreme version of what society dictates their gender should be or how they should act. I think we all noticed how forward, aggressive, and intrusive Kenichi was when he made his first appearance. It was pretty much a forced entry. He literally inserts himself into Kumi's apartment, into her life, and into the story. On the other hand, Kumi is incredibly submissive, accommodating, and polite, almost to the point where just as many of us watching were thinking how rude and intrusive Kenichi was being, so too were we wondering why Kumi didn't speak up and say anything about it. With this in mind, here's a quick Google search for gendered expectations. Seems to match up pretty well, right? The man takes, the woman gives. The show returns to this concept in episode 9 when both Kumi and Kenichi come back to this place where they first meet, a place that symbolically represents their outsider status and the place where Kenichi became the catalyst for their relationship by barging into Kumi's apartment and inserting himself into her life. What do they do when they return? to this place in episode 9, they both literally and symbolically break into their old apartment. Another insertion, another forced entry, this time into their memories of the past to get to the origin of their struggles in the present. They go over how they first met, how they misunderstood each other from the start, and finally have a conversation they probably should have had a long time ago, opening up to each other and really communicating how they feel. The result of the talk they have is a reaffirmation of their choice to own their outsiderness, their resolution to actively reject society's expectations for them as a married couple, and having this discussion in this physical and symbolic place of their old apartment is definitely fitting. Where else do gendered expectations show up, and how do they affect Kumi's and Ken's relationship and both of them as individuals? Well, with the expectation of sex and Kumi and Ken's inability to have it comes the feeling of inadequacy for both of them. For Kumi, she feels that her status as a woman is somehow invalidated and also feels a deep insecurity and powerlessness as a result. She sees all the women around her and feels paranoid that they know that she can't have sex with her husband and feels like she isn't one of them. Another part of this is the sense of powerlessness, since sex can be a major source of a woman's power. The ability to withhold sex, to be in control of when it happens, and also generally to have agency over one's own sexuality. This sexual powerlessness for Kumi starts from her very first experience of it with the boy she barely knew who pretty much raped her. In this instance, she has no power or control over the situation. Sex is something that is just supposed to happen, and it happens to her instead of her discovering and experiencing it on her own terms. She has grown up having bad associations with sex. Everyone in her town talks about sex all the time. They gossip about who has had sex with who, connecting them in this web of sex that she doesn't want to be a part of. When we think of all these things, Kumi's loss of power and control, her deep feelings of insecurity, and her deeply rooted disdain for her small town filled with gossip of sex, it becomes pretty clear why she acts the way she does, why she is at times so infuriating in her inability or choice not to speak up and speak out about the way she feels or what's happening to her. Then we have Ken, who also feels an inadequacy. He feels that he cannot satisfy his wife as a man and thus feels insecure about that. This is part of the reason he feels so betrayed when he finds out that Kumi was not a virgin, because his ego takes such a hit, knowing that it's just him and not other men that cannot have sex with Kumi. It's this same ego that causes him to just assume Kumi is a virgin to begin with. So you might have been noticing a trend here, that each of these points, although I'm telling you applies to both characters, seems to impact Kumi a lot more than Ken, or at least the show focuses and develops Kumi more than Ken in these areas. This, I believe, is intentional by the show. Thinking back to the metaphor of birth and reproduction, and Kumi and Ken's birth of a rejection of society's expectation of reproduction, we can look at the role of men and women in childbirth. The man provides the catalyst for giving birth, but then they're just pretty much done. Everything else happens inside the woman. Just like Ken is, of course, one of the main characters, and he is the catalyst for the marriage that will become the thematic landscape for this show. But it is Kumi and her body and her unique condition that the majority of the show's time is spent developing and using for its commentary. Therefore, this is why, yes, Ken feels affected by his gendered expectations from society, but the focus is more on Kumi, and Kumi is more affected than him. Yes, Ken is blamed a bit for his actions, but Kumi seems to receive the brunt of the blame for their situation. So in the spirit of recognizing that this show focuses a lot more on the women's side of things and Kumi's character as an analogy for the process of giving birth and creating a baby, let's get into talking about women's sexuality and how that also doesn't fit. Let's begin with Kumi's great aunt Etsuko. To quickly summarize, in episode 8, Kumi goes back to her hometown for her great aunt's funeral. After the funeral, there's that whole scene with Yuichi, where they both go to that abandoned building in the middle of the woods. There, they talk about their memories of Etsuko and how she used to take care of all the men who were virgins in the village. For doing this, she was judged, and ostracized, and then doesn't even get a proper, respectful burial. During Kumi's conversation with Yuichi, he explains how Japanese people used to be very free about their sexuality, but then Western Christian influence changed all of that. He refers specifically to the idea of chastity as a way for the powers that be to control women and suppress their sexuality. After all, the very idea of chastity is that women are not allowed to have sex at all for pleasure and must save themselves for their husband only. After the funeral, Kumi has a dream about her great aunt in which she tells her that the reason Kumi can't have sex with her husband is because she slept around so much. Kumi sees it as the curse of her great aunt. Okay, now that we've reminded ourselves of all this, let's connect it to what we've been talking about. First, the location of the building her aunt used to help out virgins is again very removed from society, physically far from it, out in the woods. Second, the fact that the aunt wasn't given a proper burial because the people of the village felt that she didn't deserve any respect, even after all she did for the men of that village. And as a result, her soul will be unable to rest in peace sounds like a pretty legitimate reason for a curse to come about. This really highlights society's judgment of women who express their sexuality freely. Even in death, the aunt is judged and outcasted for her actions during life. So with all of this in mind, let's now look at Kumi. When you think about it, Kumi's condition is actually a reverse form of chastity. Instead of only being able to have sex with her husband and not being able to have sex with anyone else, she is instead only able to have sex with other men and unable to have sex with her husband. It's as if her body knowingly created this built-in rejection of the idea of chastity. So here we can start to identify an alternate reason why Kumi's husband won't fit. Her body can be seen as a living rejection of Western Christian ideas of chastity, something that has suppressed women's sexuality and been used to control them. It takes away women's agency as sexual beings and would turn them into basically just baby-making machines. This suppression and loss of control within chastity can also be looked at as a silencing of women's sexuality, which ties in directly to Kumi's character and her silence and passiveness. So let's look at ways the show both conveys passiveness and silencing, since that's what Kumi is so known for. She doesn't speak up about certain things, or she just remains too passive about them. One pretty subtle way the show conveys passiveness is through its soundtrack. There are quite a few scenes where it seems like something is going on that's very serious, maybe even dark, and the music will just be this kind of like passive, lighthearted, quirky music. And I think there's a connection between this use of music and Kumi's character. This lighthearted, passive music that doesn't seem appropriate for what's going on in some of the scenes matches Kumi's own passive responses and her inability to react the way she might want to, or at the very least, the way we might want her to. Let's look at a very visual way the show conveys this idea of women being silenced by the patriarchy within the system they are expected to be a part of. Once again, we take it all the way back to the first episode. So at the end of the first episode, you might remember this pretty ridiculous, funny one-liner from Kenichi, where he asks Kumi if he can come on her face. You probably thought this was just a funny one-liner and that it was just kind of ridiculous. And it certainly is, but it also sets up this metaphor of women's sexuality being silenced by men's sexuality. To give some context, let's go over that scene. Ken and Kumi are in a love hotel, and when they find they still can't have sex, even after watching porn to get aroused, Ken's idea, by the way, they decide on Kumi giving Ken a blowjob instead of sex as a solution. The act of giving a blowjob can be looked at in a metaphorical way, and I can't believe I just said that in a YouTube video, but bear with me here, guys. Think about the act of a blowjob. It involves the very symbol of masculinity inserted into Kumi's mouth, making her unable to speak, effectively silencing her during their sexual intercourse. Now, you might be thinking, wow, dude, you're definitely reading way too much into that one scene. But it makes sense, right? It takes place at the end of the first episode as if the show wants you to focus on it. It's not just a lewd punchline, but a pretty intentional setup for a lot of this theme. It is an act and an alternative to sex that very much caters to Kenichi and his manhood while not actually addressing or catering to Kumi's womanhood. Kumi even says later on in the show that her schedule for each day involves giving Ken a blowjob because she is useless. We can follow this symbolic reading further when they get into using the baby oil, which is something actually applied to Kumi's womanness. Oh god, this is getting weird to talk about, but it's important, so I'm just gonna tough it out. And the use of baby oil starts after Kenichi meets her family and learns just a little bit more about her past and her family life, and this allows him to understand her a little bit more. After this happens, they are able to get the tip in, and I think this directly correlates to their communication and their understanding of each other being increased. And I'll go over the importance of communication later on, don't worry. Let's now bring in another concept this show introduces, which is the idea that there are women for love and women for sex. What could be the real world manifestations of these two categories? According to society, prostitutes and wives. Etsuko was judged for acting like a prostitute, when in fact she was just expressing her sexuality freely and satisfying her sexual desires. It's fine for men to have sexual appetites, for men to use women for sex, but within the rules of chastity, women's sexuality, women's sexual desires don't really seem to fit into the program. Now, in reality, Etsuko was also using those men. She was satisfying her own sexual desire. And we see this again with Ken when he goes to the brothel. One of the girls there points out that he kind of looks at women like objects, and that it's okay because she looks at her clients like objects as well. Now that we've gone over all this, we see that the show presents two different ways to look at Kumi's condition, and in doing so poses a question to us as the audience. Does Kumi's condition represent a bold rejection of Western influences of chastity and repressed sexuality, or is it a curse of having the body of a woman for sex and not a woman for love, placed upon Kumi for her aunt's sins? So I think a good place to start is with the profession of teaching, of being an educator, and thus part of the educational system. Both Kumi and Ken are teachers, and this allows for many of the themes we have been going over to run through this idea of teaching and add nuance to it along with the idea of education. Just as kids grow up being taught math, science, literature, and so on, they are also taught by society and the people around them how to behave, how to view the world, and how to think about sex and love and their own roles within their genders. Therefore, the concept of teaching is given more thematic significance, especially when considering the irony of Kumi and Ken being teachers themselves, part of a system they ultimately reject and do not feel a part of. Their jobs involve being around and interacting with children all day, who are literal, living, breathing reminders of what they are unable to have: sex, and therefore children of their own. Kumi and Ken have several discussions about education during the show, and through these discussions they talk about kids being blank slates, and it's up to teachers to mold them, to basically make sure they become people who can fit in with society and its program for life. They also wonder about who is responsible for children who don't fit, who act out. Is it the parents or the teacher's fault? At first, Kenichi adamantly says it's our duty as teachers to teach these children. We can't blame the parents, it's not their fault, and we have to take the responsibility as teachers. Over the course of the show, however, Kenichi's view changes, and in the very last episode, he admits that actually, in some cases, it is the parents' fault. We see the examples of Kumi's and Ken's parents, who are so obsessed with the idea of having children and having a legacy, of placing so much value in that programming, they actually fail as parents in a sense because they are unable to be supportive of their children and their decision. Let's also add in the fact that Kumi's mom definitely does not seem like a great mom, and her marriage to Kumi's dad does not seem like a great fit either. Let's provide some examples for this quickly. We know that Kumi's mom and dad fight a lot. We know that it was bad enough for Kumi's aunt to advise Kumi against marriage itself. The aunt tells Kumi that her mom can't get divorced even if she wanted wanted to, and this appears to be because they have children. Children can be looked at as either what keeps a marriage together as a positive, or it can also be seen as part of the reason that two people are stuck in a marriage where they don't get along and are unhappy. This connects perfectly to the symbolism of Kumi's wedding ring becoming stuck to her finger, symbolizing how marriage can feel like a trap or can feel like being stuck. And who helps her get it off? Her mother, who ironically uses baby oil to get it off. And here again is another example of a symbol of not fitting. This tremendous value placed on being able to have children also shows when Kumi's mom finds out about Kumi's condition. She becomes deeply ashamed. She even wants to apologize to Kenichi's parents as if she is sorry for producing a faulty product. The irony is that she feels she has failed as a parent not because of her inability to understand and support Kumi, but because she feels she has produced a woman who cannot have babies and thus cannot carry out her duty dictated by society, which she holds so sacred. It is this personal experience with her own mother that shapes Kumi's own opinion of marriage and having children and leads her to reject these concepts. At the very least, see their flaws. She has seen that you can get married, have sex, and have children, but still not be happy or feel in love. During Ken and Kumi's conversation about teachers and parents, when they speak about problem children or those that don't fit, they are also referring subconsciously to themselves as a couple who does not fit within society or that rebels against it. Here we can find a link between Kumi and the girl in her class, Miyuki. Just like Miyuki is deeply affected and shaped by her relationship with her mother, which in turn affects her ability to fit in with society, or in Miyuki's case in school, the tutorial for larger society, Kumi is also affected by her relationship with her mother and the idea of motherhood in general, and as a result has trouble fitting into society. They also both act out, with Miyuki being disruptive in class and Kumi finding men on the internet to meet up with, and both take place during the same episodes as if running parallel to each other. This insecurity not only completely overpowers Kumi internally, there's also added influence from external forces. Her ability as a teacher is compromised as she grows more and more paranoid about her flaws or inadequacies as a woman. As a result, she has no confidence, and the children in her class who represent everything she feels inadequate about don't respect her. They prey on her insecurities and weaknesses, and they do what they want. And this feeling of powerlessness or loss of control manifests in her workplace. In episode 5, there is this great juxtaposition of shots. First showing Kumi getting hit by paper planes in her classroom by the kids, then followed immediately by men online on the forum bombarding her with messages trying to meet up with her and have sex. In both cases, these two different groups are recognizing and taking advantage of her weakness, this insecurity that manifests as her being unable to speak up and assert herself and say what she wants or needs to. And both are representations of roles or expectations women are given by society to be sexual objects and to have kids and to nurture and raise them. Besides societal programming, Kumi and Ken also have to deal with and navigate around their biological programming. Ken can't fit. And because of this, not only do they have to deal with the judgment of society and all the people that are a part of that program, they also have to deal with going against their own base instincts and desires. Here again, we come to the nature versus nurture element. Sure, big bad society has programmed them to think about sex and love in a certain way, but they also have their own sexual drives that are without an outlet as a result of their circumstance. And we see how both Kumi and Ken deal with not being able to alleviate pent-up sexual energy. So you guys probably remember Kenichi's transitive property of equality spiel, right? Sex equals reproduction, reproduction equals instinct. Therefore, sex equals instinct. And also, there is no room for love in that equation. Love is not sex. love is trust. Here, Kenichi is referring to the biological programming of our sexuality, the base animal instinct to reproduce. It's his way of trying to dismiss the societal value of sex equals love as a lie we tell ourselves, a justification. On the other hand, by adopting this philosophy, Kenichi is also lying to himself in a way. I think in this instance, both of these ways of thinking can be considered true. In other words, while it's important to realize that sex isn't everything, it's not all that matters in relationships, it's also true that our sexuality and having sex has become a part of how we express our feelings for each other, even if it has been programmed by society. Think back to the talk Kenichi and Kumi have in their old abandoned apartment, and the irony of them coming to what seems to be a very clear and strong resolution between them, that they don't need sex to validate their marriage. They can be in love without it. In this moment, they are overcome with love for each other, and their first instinct is to have sex, which they try to do right there on the empty floor. This supposed separation between sex and love for Kenichi and Kumi is never fully absolute. At the very end of the show, this concept is verbalized when they are talking about having or not having kids. Kenichi says, "There are no absolutes about the way we feel." This theme of nothing being absolute is found throughout the show and its commentary. Kumi does not feel that she fits into the world around her, and because of that, decides to reject society's program. But does she do this because she really believes that, or is she forced to because of her own body? Even if her own body is truly a metaphor for a rejection of Western Christian ideas in Japan, of the suppression of women's sexuality, it's not something she ever asked for. It was placed upon her. Hence the curse angle. This is why I believe the interpretation of her condition as being a reverse form of chastity makes sense, because either way you look at it, metaphorical rejection or chastity itself, agency is being taken away from a woman. Kumi doesn't like society and the value it places on sex, her small town with all the gossip, the obsession with babies and being a mother, but she also wishes to be able to express her love of Ken through intimacy and, yes, sex. Let's go a little bit deeper with this idea of separating sex and love. These are two concepts that are very much intertwined and can also be tied in with how we think about the two main characters themselves. When Kumi and Ken first meet and start dating, they seem to be almost inseparable. Kumi remarks how Ken and her pretty much become the same person. She attends the same classes as him, joins the same clubs, and basically lives the same life. Later in episode 9, where they go back to revisit their old apartment, Kumi and Ken both admit that they came back to this place in order to remember themselves as individuals before they met each other. They feel that they rushed into their relationship, became one, before they really got to know each other as individuals, and this started from the moment they met and their feelings surrounding their initial impressions of each other. When they have this talk in their old apartment, they are finally able to understand each other better as individuals, and in doing so, are able to function better as a couple. Just like over the show, both characters try to separate the concepts of love and sex and use the idea of them being two separate things to better understand their relationship. This is something that I think is really important for us as the audience to think about as well. While love and sex are most certainly intertwined in our lives and our relationships with others, they also don't always have to go hand in hand. They aren't always one and the same. And it's this that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. In other words, it can lead to getting the wrong impression. And this is probably the main focus of the show's depiction of no absolutes in feelings. And we can clearly see it with these two characters. Love and sex being the same thing doesn't have to be a law that defines and validates their relationship, but on the other hand, it also seems impossible to completely separate them for good. Besides this concept of no absolutes, besides all the other themes and symbolism and commentary, at the heart of everything, what is it that really helps save Kumi and Ken's relationship? You might have heard this a million times when people talk to you and try to give you advice about relationships, and it might seem really cliche or trite, but I'm telling you, it's the real deal. It's very important. And yes, we are talking about communication. It is their communication that allows Kumi and Ken to reach their renewed sense of love for and understanding of each other. It takes them a while, but they finally talk it out. They finally say what they really feel, and they finally bring up the things that they had been silent about before. I think a big part of this was also that they stopped feeling sorry for each other, which was something they both realized they were doing. This feeling prevented them from bringing up any of these issues to the other because they didn't want to hurt them or make them feel bad. In the end, this actually only ended up leading to further misunderstanding and unresolved feelings. I think the value of communication is something that comes back full circle to the title of the show. My Husband Won't Fit is a very loud and bold title. It communicates to anybody thinking of watching the show or anybody that reads about the show exactly what the show is about. It's the first thing you find out about the show and the characters. And ironically, it's the longest kept secret within the show itself. Kumi and Ken never tell anyone their secret, the thing that they struggle with all this time. The only time it's ever revealed is by Kumi, who blurts it out during the gathering of both of their parents. Before this, they never tell anyone, not their friends, not their coworkers, not even a doctor. And this is why the scene where Kumi finally blurts out the truth in front of her parents and Kenichi's parents that her husband does not fit is so important. She finally comes out and says directly and clearly and bluntly what she hasn't been able to say for the entire show. And the fact that she's saying it in front of both parents who are obsessed with the idea of having babies, reproduction, following that program, which is part of the society that she has felt rejected from and does not like and doesn't want to be a part of, makes it even more impactful and a powerful moment. This entire system, this conditioning, it's been weighing on both of them as a couple the entire show and causing them so much stress. And it's a great moment for them as a couple when they are sitting around laughing about what Kumi said in front of their parents. It shows that they are finally able to start freeing themselves from that pressure and are able to just laugh it off and find that whole system absurd and obsessive. And it doesn't seem like such a big deal, but just the fact that they can laugh about it afterwards is huge for their characters. And this comes back to everything we've gone over during this analysis. We can't look at this purely in a literal sense. The message of the show is not that, well, if your husband doesn't fit and you're having trouble in the bedroom, you just have to tell everyone, or that you should be telling everyone about your sex life. We have to remember what reasons the show offers for why Kumi's husband won't fit. And in doing so, we can find what the show is truly advocating to be talked about. The suppression of women's sexuality and the double standards inherent within the way we view women's sexuality in society, for example. This is a topic that should never be silenced and should be recognized and addressed. During the start of this analysis, I said that this show doesn't really aim to provide answers, but rather focuses on asking questions instead. These are the questions the show leaves us with. What is love? What is marriage really? What does it mean to be a woman, a man, a husband, a wife? How much of how we act and how we think about ourselves is instinctual, and how much do we learn as a result of social conditioning? It really comes down to how you look at it, right? We can look at Kumi and Ken's decision and their philosophy, their family motto as an excuse, not wanting to admit defeat. But we can also look at the act of having children itself as an excuse to stay married, and humanity not wanting to admit defeat to its mortality by carrying on the legacy of family names. Kumi sees her condition as a curse for most of the show, but ends up resolving to think about it as a decision she made, and in doing so, regains some control in a part of her life where she felt she had none. Is it absolute? Does she really feel that strongly about her rejection of society and biology? Maybe not. But she commits far enough to let her live her life peacefully and happily with Kenichi. This goes on down the line. Each question raised is a result of these different issues being subject to different interpretations, and in most cases they don't come down to an either or. Most times it's a little bit of both, because there are seldom any absolutes in life. And since everyone undoubtedly has different interpretations of these questions and these issues, it's probably pretty important to communicate with one another so we can better understand each other going into and furthering and evolving our own relationships with others. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this analysis. As I always say at the end of my deep dive reviews, if you watch this all the way to the end, I thank you, I appreciate you, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you at least got a little something out of it. How did you feel about this show? Was it interesting and deep, stupid and annoying, a little bit of both? Let me know in the comments. If you did enjoy the review, you can thank Norwegian Wood, who stayed on me tirelessly about getting this review done. And with that being said, that's it for me. Thanks for visiting the channel. This is TwoTenEast. Hope to see you again real soon.